So good afternoon. I want to thank all of you for being here today on this lovely, muggy day in Washington. My name's Andrew Mertha, and I'm the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies and the Director of the SAIS China Global Research Center here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. We have a terrific program today featuring two extremely accomplished scholars with backgrounds that are particularly relevant today. Una Aleksandra Berzina-Cerenkova is our featured speaker, and Maria Repnikova is going to be the discussant for today's program. I'll try to get a word in here and there, but we will hear from our two guests who, particularly from initially, We will start initially hearing from Professor Berzina-Cerenkova, who will present her new book, A Perfect Imbalance, followed by discussion between the two of them, and then finally open up the discussion to our audience. Please note that Zhuoran Li, otherwise known as Z, is the person with the microphone, and please wait till you get the microphone to ask your questions, because this is being recorded and we want to be able to hear your voice. And when you do ask a question, please let everybody know who you are, just so that we can know each other better. So before proceeding, I want to thank many people for making today possible. Ellie Rostrom, Gabby Hendy, Zhuoran Li /Z, Hosta Coleman, Michaela Tucker, Pedro Matias, Alana Sardillo, and Jessica Moreno, and hopefully I'm not leaving anybody out. They made this possible, and I want to thank all of you for showing up, because this is a much nicer turnout than one has any right to expect at this point in the semester. So I want you all to give yourselves a round of silent applause as well, or not silent applause. And now our speakers. Dr. Una Aleksandra Berzina-Cerenkova is a political scientist, China scholar, head of political science PhD program and China Studies Center at Riga Stratins University. She's head of the Asia program at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, a member of CHERN and European Think Tank Network on China, ETNC, which we were talking about a little earlier, yes. So after having defended her doctoral dissertation on Chinese political discourse in the Hu Jintao period, she has held senior visiting research scholar positions at Fudan University, at the School of Philosophy, a Fulbright visiting scholar position at the Stanford Center for East Asia Studies, and a Merrick's European China Policy Fellowship. She publishes on PRC political discourse, contemporary Chinese ideology, EU-China relations, as well as Belt and Road and other transcontinental interconnectivity narratives. And those narratives feature prominently, particularly at the front end of her terrific book, which is, as I said, it's entitled A Perfect Imbalance, China and Russia. And it is published by World Scientific Publishing Company, and it came out this year, which should be a must-read for anybody interested in Russia or China's role in the world today, but it extends its reach, as do the two countries, to the Arctic, to South and Southeast Asia, and to Central Asia, with implications for the entire world. It is truly one of the books where you have to simply stop highlighting, because every single sentence contains important nuggets of information and wisdom. Our discussant, Maria Repnikova, is and I'm going to pause for dramatic effect here, associate professor in global communication at Georgia State University. She was a Wilson Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and in the past, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Project for Advanced Research in Global Communications at the Annenberg School for Communication, University of Pennsylvania. She received her doctorate in politics at the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. Maria specializes in China's critical journalism, political persuasion, and soft power, especially in the African context. She also looks at China-Africa cultural exchanges, China-Russia comparisons, and so on. She's the author of Media Politics in China, Improvising Power Under Authoritarianism, Cambridge 2017. I can't believe it's been 5 years. Too long. And Chinese Soft Power, part of the Cambridge Elements series, which came out this year. And she's working also currently on a much larger monograph on that, on that theme of soft power in Africa. But now let me cede the microphone over to our speaker, Professor Una Aleksandra Berzina-Cerenkova.
This is the one presentation when I've actually read the book that I'll be talking about. Kidding. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Andy, for your kind words. And so today, just a disclaimer, I think this is going to be a conversation, and I'm not asserting any exceptional knowledge, and I know that this is a topic which is so complex that you can approach it from any number of angles, and I'm just humbly presenting my surface scratching in the area. So the main question, as I realized I have to work on China-Russia, that had been on my mind and that had been asked by scholars and by colleagues, was how close really is China and Russia? And then you know how it goes. There's a spectrum of opinions. There are some who talk about dragon bear emerging, whereas others talk about a drift and saying that, in fact, it is all for show. So, and that, when I started writing, was my central and immediate concern, to find ways to answer this question and to design the research to answer this question. And just immediately, I want to go to my central argument, where do I stand on the spectrum, so that I can state that and we can discuss. I believe that, of course, there are limits to the partnership without limits, and they all boil down to lack of trust. So that is where I stand. But let me explain why I believe that. First of all, this relationship has been, if we have to draw a line, then of course we can talk about the Treaty of Nerchinsk 330 some years ago. Another important date, 70-something years ago, was the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. And yet, even though hundreds and decades of years have passed, the leaders of China and Russia today speak that this is the highest level of their relationship in history. And actually, this is the one point where we could agree that looking back at these 330-something years of exchanges, this is indeed a high point. Of course, there's always the discussion of whether this reminds us of the 50s, and that's why I mentioned the Sino-Soviet Treaty, but that's also an open question. But why is it important to research this partnership then? Because it is it's a very multifaceted relationship, of course, and it really brings about a new phase in the post-Cold War era period, because it holds political, economic, security, environmental, and technological implications for all of us, including here in the States. So this is not just a Eurasian topic, right? But anything else beyond that conclusion, and I think on that we can agree that it's an important topic and it's a multifaceted partnership that has global implications. But beyond that, the discussion is really wide. Everything is subject to debate. First of all, I mean, you've heard the questions. Are these two moving towards a security alliance? That's the question that I also try to answer. Secondly, is Russia a junior partner and knows it and acts accordingly? Third of all, do they have some sort of a division of labor in terms of their roles in the regions that are next to them, for example, in Central Asia? And what limits are there to the partnership? More recent questions that people have been asking: did Xi Jinping know about Putin's invasion plans into the Ukraine? How well did he know? What did he know? And the scary thing, of course, in our jobs is that we can't really know for sure. But when you don't know for sure, how do you even brand this relationship? How do you call it if there are so many open questions? And I propose the concept of perfect imbalance. And let me tell you why. It is a concept which comes from the game development industry. And what it means is that when you have a multiplayer game online, for example, you have people who have been playing for a long time. They're very experienced. They have a high level of they're strong, right? They're unbeatable practically. But if they're unbeatable, then the game industry postulates, then we don't have any business because there's no point for the weaker players to join in. So we're going to be losing business. So what they've come up with is this idea of perfect imbalance. I didn't come up with that name, but it comes from them. It means that when they introduce a weaker player, or when a weaker player appears in the game, he always has some way to beat the best. And on the other hand, the strong player can never become complacent and can never just kind of drift and think about their own strength because they can always lose. So it's kind of a sleep with one eye open approach. Now, let me tell you why I think it is a good concept for the Russia-China relationship. And I have 3 reasons. Let's see if you'll agree. First of all, and because I think this helps us to break out of some not always helpful boxes when we talk about this, or cliches when we talk about the Russia-China relationship. The first cliche that we all know is the relationship is asymmetrical. Yes, it is asymmetrical, of course, but it's really hard to point out a relationship in the international affairs where it would be a completely symmetrical one, right? So I think that the fact that and I think the perfect imbalance means that sides don't have to be symmetrical to interact and to cooperate in some cases, because in these, according to the game developers, these 2 players at times also have to team up. So as long as one side has leverage, even if it's imbalanced in objective terms, and as long as there's a level of interdependence, so these 2 aspects have to, so these 2 boxes have to be ticked, leverage and interdependence. And in the Russia-China case, of course, there's leverage even on the Russian side, and of course, there's interdependence. There's a border, right? As long as that is the case, perfect imbalance as a relationship can happen, can be an active relationship. Now, the second reason. Another unhelpful concept that we hear a lot when we talk about the Russia-China relationship is that it's unstable. Of course, in some cases, I'm not going to argue, not going to say that it's never helpful. Of course, in some analysis, it's helpful. But sometimes overall, as a cliche, the fact that it's an unstable relationship, I find that it doesn't tell us much. And in fact, as per perfect imbalance, it is normal that a relationship is unstable because the side that is disadvantaged is going to always try to use all sorts of means, be sneaky, and include other parties. That is something that I try to show what Russia does when it tries to bring India on board all the time. But and there's always anxiety long term. So I think the message that we also hear sometimes, the question that we're asked when we talk to the journalist, is this a marriage of convenience or is this a match made in heaven? I don't think that's particularly helpful, because it is the fact that it's not a very stable relationship still allows it to be a working relationship. And third of all, because rhetorically, of course, we need 3 reasons to make it work, I kind of like the logic that perfect imbalance is a strategy. Because another unhelpful concept is this perception that the relationship between Russia and China is just how things are. That it is a result of the Russian soul plus the Chinese civilization somehow. But I do believe that it is not an anarchic result of some forces beyond human control. It is a relationship that's being crafted from within and, of course, being influenced from beyond as well. Now I will talk about the method a little bit. I'm a discourse analyst, so that means, of course, I fall back on using language to explain social phenomena. You're going to see a lot of that in the book. What I do is I look at, just like my colleagues, I look at how meanings are created on 3 levels. So intratextually, within the text, what can we see? Intertextually, so how does the text interact with the wider context and with other texts? And then, of course, this is where discourse analysis gets a lot of criticism saying, well, these are just stories, right? At the end of the day, you can talk a big game, but it doesn't necessarily have to be true. And I agree with this criticism, just like my colleagues do, and that's why the third level, of course, is when you measure it to the extra-textual reality. And funny enough, another takeaway is that in the case of the stories the Russians and the Chinese tell about their mutual cooperation, the narratives do very seldomly match reality. So the relationship between the second the level and the third level is indeed not a direct one. And so in order to do that, of course, I fell back on document analysis a lot. I interviewed experts as well as practitioners and stakeholders. And definitely this was a questions-driven approach rather than a very rigorous methodological approach. And this is where I really like to quote the ambassador of Latvia to China, who, when the relationship was which was quite active, and I was working as an interpreter a lot as well. So I was trying to explain what I think about why Belt and Road is trying to reach the Baltics, and he just tells me, you know what? Go ahead and read all you can find in all those languages that you know, and just tell me what the hell is happening. and that's the approach I kind of have adapted methodologically. Which is fine because, of course, discourse analysis requires looking at non-discursive practices anyway. Now to the time frame. When does the present start? That's a question we discussed a couple of weeks ago with Andy's colleague Bill Hurst at Cambridge. And we couldn't really, and of course, there's never a good line, so you have to pick your story and stick with it. And if I have to pick, I would pick 2013, 2014 as the line for this new relationship for two reasons. Of course, the obvious reason, as we always teach our students, is take a look when a new leader comes in and what are they going to do, and that's like a natural line, right? Of course, so Xi Jinping becoming Secretary General in 2012 and then President 2013, that's like a good line naturally. But on top of that, let's not forget 2014, Crimea. Sanctions against Russia. So Russia was becoming isolated and was more interested in boosting this relationship with China. So, but again, I'm sure that we can come up with many dates to try and find the line, because by 2013, 2014, Putin had been in power for 14 years, right? So if there's somewhere, and it doesn't necessarily have to start with Xi Jinping. So it's up to you to draw the line. Now, let me talk about the actual thing, the book. So if you remember, the initial question was, how close is the relationship between Putin's Russia and Xi's China really getting? And how do I approach that? So first, I decided to look into how Putin and Xi, and of course their foreign policy establishments, how they frame the relationship, how they talk about it. So the strategic narratives of cooperation bilaterally. And examining the documents, the speeches, the pressers, everything that you usually do, three kind of big stories immediately popped out and kept repeating themselves over and over throughout the documents. The first story, close friendship between the leaders personally. So Xi and Putin doing all these things together, riding the boat down Neva River, eating pancakes, making pancakes, watching ice hockey. So the relationship that if the leaders are really good friends, then obviously somehow the nations are also good friends. And this is what some of your colleagues also say brings them back to the 50s and kind of brings back the... I believe even this talk on Twitter, when it was publicized, there was a comment saying, oh, this reminds me of, and then a picture of the 50s, like China-Russia friendship forever, right? So that's one, the personal relationship. The second big narrative was the idea of the promise of high value-added cooperation between Russia and China. And that promise was made towards the Russians. So whenever you would see Li Keqiang or Xi Jinping as well, or Wang Yi, speaking to their Russian counterparts, it would have the promise of, we want to cooperate with you in technology. We know how Russia is innovative. So that is obviously meant to counter the reality, because I said that the stories don't necessarily match reality in the China-Russia relationship case, to counter the reality that the lion's share of the cooperation, of course, is in natural resources and is very low value added, and in fact makes Russians quite wary of the relationship. So this idea that, and this has been noticed, right? And so the narrative is being dispatched across the border saying, no, we want to boost this synergy in high tech. Now, the third big narrative that showed up in these documents was the attempts to reconcile the competing visions of Eurasian connectivity of Russia and China. So talk about two different things, Xi Jinping's vision of Belt and Road and Putin's vision of Eurasian Economic Union, but talk about them in a way that endorses each other, even though they disagree on it. And that's, again, how reality has nothing to do with stories. To me, that's amazing. So you know how before COVID, Putin was the star guest on BRI Fora. He was talking, it was like the main act, talking about Eurasian connectivity. But basically what he talked about was his vision. And we all know somehow that if you ask someone, or if you're approached by a journalist, oftentimes people who don't research this, they're under the perception that Russia is the #1 fan of Belt and Road and has joined Belt and Road, in fact, which is not true. So that I found extremely interesting, that the stories across the border that are being thrown in terms of these strategic narratives are, we both want to connect Eurasia, but in Russia, the story is being told, Xi Jinping endorses Putin's vision. There was an article, in fact, that came out in the Russian state media. It was called Belt and Putin. And whereas on the Chinese side, it's the other way around. It's saying Putin endorses Xi's vision and bows his head and says it's a great plan. And the funny thing, and another takeaway, is that the information spaces between Russia and China, regardless of the friendship without cooperation without limits, is so sealed that these stories, if they're conflicting or if they're contradictory, they don't really make it across the border, and there's really no marketplace of ideas, no boxing ring where these ideas fight it out. They just don't meet each other. And that's something that's being really kept sealed. Now, that was the first level, of course, just to look at the stories of the overarching narratives. But then the next step, the intratextual step, was to probe into how the two establishments frame these more tangible aspects of cooperation, but still talk, right? Still framing. And where I could, I tried to cross-check where these stories, to cross-check how do these stories match up against what was happening on the ground. And that's where interviews came in, of course. So, and this is where the case studies come in that Andy already mentioned. So there's the Arctic, there's the security cooperation, trying to answer that question of whether or not there's going to be an alliance. And let me tell you, I wouldn't bet on it. That's not how I see things. I do not believe that a full mutual defense clause security alliance is in the making between these countries. So security, the Arctic. Then I looked at how China acts in Central Asia and how China and Russia interact in Central Asia and what they're trying to do, and whether there's this division of labor, right? Russia security, China economy, whatever. You've also heard that cliche, right? There's some truth to it, but it's much more complicated than that. And actually, I want to say about about Central Asia, I was really shown that I went into this research a little bit from a wrong perspective, and my colleagues from Kazakhstan actually pointed out as I was asking them this question. So is there a zero-sum game going on a little bit between Russia and China? the opinion that was given to me by Professor Nargis Kasenova, who's also written an afterword for this book, was she's at Harvard now with the Davis Center, was, why would you think that there's not enough space in Central Asia to accommodate everyone? Central Asia has such massive room for growth that it has enough space to accommodate Russia, China, Turkey, even you guys in the EU, if you move a little bit, then accommodate you, and of course the US as well. So the perception that there's somehow limited space where China and Russia interact was wrong. My initial perception was wrong. Then another, of course, to even out the story of Central Asia, I decided to look at, I realized I would need a case study closer to China, to take a look how Russia acts there then. And after talking to colleagues and talking to stakeholders, I realized the Vietnam case was an interesting story, and the story of the oil rig of Rosneft participating in the drilling. So Vietnam was another story, and it coming to the conclusion that, in fact, it was not, Russia couldn't really challenge China in Vietnam. It tried, and it took pride in it, saying, yes, of course, we're going to do it. We're going to drill and help Vietnam drill in these contested waters. But at the end of the day, they were awkwardly asked to leave by the same partners that had invited them to come in the first place, showing that China's pressure was quite strong. Then another chapter is about India, because I already stressed how important India is for Russian policymaking. From the times of the Primakov Doctrine already. And I also looked at the Sino-Russian complementarity in space. And my last chapter was about COVID. Not a very good chapter, to be honest. I did look at the, it's true. I mean, I think I failed to, at the end of, it was early stages, it was the first wave. I did find some mutual learning examples. But in terms of narratives, I think because I didn't have time or I didn't have the experience, I couldn't, it needs to be sharpened, in other words, so don't read that chapter, it's not very good. Now, let me just say that to summarize, of course, I do not believe that a Russian-Chinese alliance will emerge, because, to quote Dmitry Trenin, Russia has not pivoted towards China or anyone, it's pivoted towards itself, and that's a good way to name the extreme defense nationalism that has taken over. But that doesn't mean that this relationship will not continue to grow. Again, I think it's a false dilemma. Either they enter into mutual binding security clause or they drift apart. I don't think so. I think there's a lot for this comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for a new era. They will continue to search for a perfect imbalance because domestically there are, because of both domestic and international factors, and domestically, of course, there are a lot of similarities between how Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin see national governance. There's a learning curve in ideologies, information control, and even administrative strategies, as the COVID chapter showed. And as the information spaces are so sealed, they're not really worried about this issues emerging, because there's no communication across. And that's why I'm super happy to have Maria here, who has researched the border, actually, and has been there and knows how these things, because I have not been there. And in my book, I use the example of the Aygun Museum where the Russians are not being let in with the Russian passport. I was wondering if you could also comment on that, because I think that would be very interesting for me to hear as well. So if there's any truth to this, about information not making it across the border. But of course, internationally, the big parallel is the common enemy, so to speak, the US in the eyes of both Russia and China. And I think we saw that in how China amplifies Russia's narratives after the invasion in Ukraine, specifically about the US being to blame. That's very much showing. So this is not about going all the way in with Russia's vision, but this is about nitpicking and cherry picking. Oh, this narrative suits us. And that's the one that's the anti-US narrative. And it's going to obviously grow stronger now as our neighbors, Finns and Swedes, have decided to join NATO. But of course, challenges remain. The dilemma of long-term competition, the security misgivings are crazy. You know how Russia routinely jails people who are for having disclosed state secrets, including to China, right? So on one hand, a researcher of the Arctic was encouraged to go to China and to do these exchanges, but on the other hand, he's right now still in jail. And of course, Russia, as per Perfect Imbalance, keeps trying to fall back on other partners in Asia, notably India, and it's not being met with unconditional trust on the Indian side either. China is much more ambitious globally. It deems Russian outlashes towards the West, including the war in Ukraine, to be counterproductive to international stability at times. So Xi Jinping's goal is not necessarily a disruptivist development goal, whereas Putin's goal is quite disruptivist. Again, very arguable, I know, but that's how I... Just trust me. Just trust me, man. And Beijing really likes to strategize for de-escalation, whereas Russia is more complicated. So, and now let me talk about the limitations a little bit. So first of all, I'm a qualitative scientist. I'm very bad when it comes to quantitative data. We have Professor Balzer here, he would understand my problem because he works with economy a lot, but that I've been avoiding quantitative data and quantitative analysis just because of my limitations. Secondly, interviewing, in terms of method and access, is always complicated, and I think it's great that we had. And Professor Repnikova, of course, doesn't understand this problem because she's been doing that for years. But I did encounter that. And for example, Tim Rulik, my colleague out of Germany, uses this triple confirmation approach when he analyzes Chinese foreign policy. So basically, in his interviews, he's like, okay, unless this shows up in 3 different interviews, I'm not putting it in the book. I can't do that because there's just not. If I would do the triple confirmation, it would be like 5 pages long. So that's my story. And again, just to go back on the takeaways, first of all, it's a developing relationship, but it's not moving towards a binding alliance, in my opinion. Second of all, stories don't match reality. Third of all, their distrust among populations and leaders as well prevails, and past grievances are not forgotten, but the outside projection of the relationship is that of a friendship without limits at a never-before stage. But why don't I believe that China stands fully with Russia in Russia's war and generally? Of course, geopolitically from the Baltic and Polish interest, and I'm from the Baltic, so I would have to agree that Russia and China are getting too close for comfort now. And definitely we're going to see more rhetoric support towards the Russian story. But I still believe, looking at the bilateral dynamic, that the distrust and the dysfunctionality, quite frankly, of the cooperation is very hard to overcome. I'm sorry for talking so long. That's over and out. Thank you so much.
It's a lot of light here. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Great. So thank you so much to Una Berzina-Cerenkova. I'm trying to do both last names in different accents. It's really nice to meet you in person. We've been in touch over email, and actually she has just met my mom in Latvia, so it was a really personal connection to this story as well. But it's very lovely to be able to read the book and to discuss it and to go back to the story of China-Russian relations that I originally started studying as an undergraduate student at Georgetown with Professor Balzer, who's here with us today, and the story that I went back to in my research over time, but I'm kind of revisiting, and I'm actually inspired by the book to think more about the information aspect of this relationship, right? The kind of sealed environments, the information environments, and to what extent is that shifting, or is there a possibility to crack them? How much is there convergence across these information spaces? So I'm inspired by this book to kind of maybe explore that in my next big project after I finish the current one. So that's in the next coming year. But to talk a little bit more in more detail about this book, which I very much enjoyed, I want to talk about some of the key takeaways that I kind of captured from reading it. Some of it will overlap with what was already presented, but hopefully there's some new insight there as well. And then I wanted to pose some questions for Una for our discussion as well. I'll begin with just a brief summary of what I took away from the project. So the book is very illuminating, multifaceted analysis of the China-Russia relations, operating in both languages. It's important to know that Una does speak, read, and is able to interview in both Chinese and Russian, which is a very rare combination. And she's drawing on a wide range of sources. She was very humble in her presentation of her work, talking about, discursive analysis as having its limitations. Obviously, that's the case. But at the same time, if you note, the extent of what she's capturing, it includes policy documents, leadership speeches, media reports, elite interviews. So it's quite a wide scope of data, actually. So it depends how you frame that, analysis. One could say that it's actually quite expansive. So it depends on how you talk about this. And I would say, you have to take more credit for the amount of work you've done on this. So the book presents a timely and much needed analysis on this topic. There are, of course, a number of scholars working in this field, but I would say we need a lot more. It's an understudied topic, and given the current realities, right, of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, as Una has mentioned, there are lots of binary kind of boxed-in thinking about this relationship, whether China is pro-Russia, it's going to save Russia in this war, or it's going against Russia. So there's this kind of black and white sort of scenarios that are being played out, which don't really capture what's actually going on in the context of this war, but also more broadly in the context of this relationship. So this book, in my view, is a sobering analytical kind of framework and overview about convergences and frictions between China and Russia across geopolitical issues and regional contexts. So the book takes us on a journey from high-level bilateral narratives to the dynamics of the evolving security cooperation, to China-Russia collaboration, competition in the Arctic, Central Asia, but also Vietnam and India, which, maybe we can talk more about in the Q&A, were very interesting kind of adds-on as case studies, right? How Russia is engaging in Vietnam, to what extent it has or hasn't succeeded in kind of playing against China or helping Vietnam play against China. But also India is this really important partner, and whenever I give talks on this topic, India comes up as kind of the card that ruins me. I'm like, okay, I don't study India, so I don't know what to say. But now I'm really well informed about how India is coming into this partnership with Russia. It was really interesting to read and learn about that. The relationship, the way it's captured, as Una has mentioned and discussed in detail, is this metaphor of perfect imbalance. It's an interesting metaphor to play with. Of course, capturing kind of the strength and weakness of these relative powers, but also the fact that weaker players, in this case Russia, do have some advantages, right? That they're not just kind of unequal, but they have certain ways of perhaps playing against their weaknesses, or playing against the stronger player in their own kind of elastic ways. So the key kind of takeaways for me beyond this broader framework are the frictions and the kind of challenges in this relationship. I thought that to me was the most interesting part. I think that's something that I took away as the core of the book. So the first key kind of friction or challenge, and again, this already echoes Una's presentation, but I wanted to talk about this a bit more, is the gap between narratives and actions and policies, right? I think this gap is really interesting, and the book captures this in a lot of detail, but it will be great to discuss further on why this gap exists, and is this gap going to eventually narrow, or is this how this relationship is going to proceed indefinitely? So across different policy and regional arenas, what is striking about these engagements between China and Russia is the gap between rhetorical congruence, a lot of rhetorical kind of messaging back and forth, and policy in action, or even contradictory policy making. So sometimes there's nothing happening, sometimes what's happening on the ground goes completely against the rhetoric that's being positioned in these speeches. So in the context of space exploration, something that was a really interesting chapter as well that Una hasn't talked about as much in her presentation, but I think it's a really important area for their China-Russia collaboration. Both sides have pledged closer partnership, but in practice, as Una writes, technological nationalism, and I'm quoting her directly, on both sides of the border will leave little room for deep cooperation. So there's kind of fear, distrust about, from both sides in terms of engaging deeper into the space exploration mission and supporting each other vis-a-vis the US or competing vis-a-vis the West. In the context of COVID-19 diplomacy, at the rhetorical level, Russia and China joined arms in battling the pandemic. Russian officials even equating the battle against COVID with that of the Second World War, which of course Russian officials tend to equate many things with the Second World War. So it's a popular metaphor. In practice, however, Russia was quick to close borders with China, to halt a number of major economic projects, basically to kind of disengage from China. So the rhetoric was all about celebrating China's initiatives. China is helping the world, but in practice, Russia was quite worried, as Una writes, sealing the borders, stopping exchanges, and also lots of racialized discourse coming out at the popular level about China and fears of China on the ground. So that's another kind of example of friction. We also see this kind of friction taking place in other contexts, right? In the context of scientific collaboration, right? And something that Professor Balzer, who is in the audience today, has written extensively about, the rhetorical promises have also materialized into limited gains, at least for Russia, right? So the idea and the way that Una writes about it as well is that China is promising Russia something better, right? We're not just taking your resources, you can, collaborate with us in this high-tech development. But in the book, Una herself quotes Ivan Danilin as this expert saying that with all the liveliness of China-Russia relations in the field of science, technology, and innovation, they have been extremely small in scale and deprived of any visible systematicity and depth. So I think it's quite a scathing depiction. It's basically the language is very flowery and beautiful, but there's basically nothing to it almost. That's what this quote suggests. And it would be great to hear from Professor Balzer, from his research, what is there, when it comes to scientific collaboration? What are the findings that you're arguing or presenting in your book about on this matter? I think it's very important. So this gap between narratives and practical visions and actions is in large part explained by mutual distrust. That's something that is at the core of the book, as the core argument, that permeates this relationship, a distrust rooted in deep historical grievances, as well as in power asymmetry between China and Russia. So this distrust factor seems to be at the heart of this puzzle of why we're seeing these frictions or gaps. And the distrust is especially notable in the Arctic, where Russia has been very hesitant to collaborate with China, in part not trusting its promises of acting as a responsible power, which is also kind of ironic because I wonder if Russia itself is acting as a responsible power, especially in the environmental domain. So is it really setting an example, or to what extent can it judge China in this context? But it was interesting to see that Russian officials seem to be worried about China basically misbehaving in the Arctic. But it is bringing in India, however, to collaborate closer in the Arctic, which is also interesting. Are they having similar concerns about India as well? In my research with Professor Balzer many years ago about the China-Russia border, we also found that this distrust is especially, permeating and present at the local level, right, across the border. And it really inhibits the premise of China-Russia cooperation on the border, in the border regions, right? The local officials on the Russian side in particular had a really heavy distrust for China. And in many ways slowing down this partnership at the economic level, for instance, slowing down the visa access, right, to labor migrants coming from China, slowing down business permits, basically making it very difficult to do business with Russia. And I think that hasn't changed that much from the work I've been reading by other scholars of the Far East. It seems like that feature, that facet is still there, this idea of kind of slowing down or inhibiting on China's presence in practical terms. This gap in narratives and inaction is also very important in the context of the current war in Ukraine, right? Rhetorically, or at least in the media communication, propaganda, right, communication in China's official media, China has been leaning more towards Russia, right? There's kind of this pro-Russia leaning, and I've been analyzing this issue in my current kind of public writings, and I did find that basically there's a mix of messaging. Almost half of the messaging by Xinhua News Agency, for instance, is either pro-Russia, it's kind of leaning towards Russian sources, and half of it is anti-Western, right? So it's kind of this mix of themes, but very little balanced reporting and very, very little pro-Ukraine or sources coming out of Ukraine. So we see this kind of messaging. But at the same time, when we look at the policies, are China's policies mirroring the propaganda? I think that's a bigger question. And when we look at the policies so far, China has been abiding by Western sanctions vis-a-vis Russia applied by the West in light of Ukraine, and also not aiding militarily in this war so far. So maybe this will change, but I tend to think they're unlikely to enter this war more actively in supporting Russia. So there's a gap in policy and rhetoric here when in the context of this war. And what I'm trying to figure out in my own work is why, why is there this gap? What explains the gap? Is it the propaganda bureaucracy? Is it the kind of bureaucratic pressures? Is it that the competition across different bureaucracies? Is it about strategic ambiguity for China? What explains this difference in actions and rhetoric? So that I find that to be really interesting. So the second intriguing gap that comes up in this book, in Una's book, in the analysis, is the kind of the gap between the narrative sold to external audiences and domestic audiences. So domestic versus external, and that's something that Una talked about the sealed-off environments, right? The kind of between China and Russia, which I think is also extremely interesting. As I mentioned, I'm very inspired by this finding in my own future research. So Una illustrates how externally the two countries often present a shared narrative of intensifying friendship and defiance against the West, but domestically both countries tend to narrate a story from their own perspective of who is winning in this relationship. So we see this kind of relative wins being played to domestic audiences, and then the external messaging is all about mutual friendship. But also we see that nationalistic grievances about one another persist domestically. So even though it seems, again, at the external level, there's this friendship between Xi and Putin, in the domestic kind of scene, we see that a lot of grievances, especially maybe on the Chinese side, about the territories that have been claimed and taken over by Russia in the Far East as being kind of an unjust takeover, right? So my favorite vignette from the book, which Una already alluded to, was about the Anhui Historical Museum, located across the river from the Russian border, telling the story of Chinese historic claims over the Far East, with Russian passport holders denied entry into this exhibit. So I found that to be just a fascinating vignette. I did not visit this exhibit, or maybe it wasn't there when I was doing research many years ago. I'd love to revisit and see, more about this. But I find that just story very illuminating about, deliberate denial of entry, but also a very different story being told right across the border. So that's a really interesting insight. Some of these ironies have also come up in the context of this war. So in analyzing social media discussions about the war in China, for instance, I found nationalistic voices at once expressing pro-Russia sympathies and calling for China to take back its lands, while Russia is weak. So at the same time, the same person might say, yeah, we're pro-Russia, Russia's doing the right thing, but at the same time, let's take the lands back because Russia is weaker now. So we see this kind of ironies playing out, like literally right now in the context of the war. And the third, the final, key friction that I find really interesting is the bilateral versus external orientation of this relationship, right? That's something we haven't talked as much yet, but again, was alluded to in Una's comments. The idea that the key kind of unifying theme of this relationship is really the appearances and the symbolic signaling towards the West, and especially the United States. So how much of this relationship is really oriented towards one another, Russia versus China, and how much of it is really Russia-China signaling to the US and playing, on one another to basically project strength vis-a-vis the West? Balancing out the influence of the West. In her analysis, Dr. Cerenkova repeatedly points to how the two powers depend on one another in carving out a competitive edge vis-a-vis the US. In the context of space collaboration, China needs Russia's technological know-how to be able to expand its capabilities. She writes about how, despite its big, legacies and dreams, it's actually quite weak technologically. So it needs China's support. Russia needs China's resources, investments to maintain and expand its space program. And China needs Russia's know-how. So we have this kind of exchanges that supposedly would work. But the key aim is to compete against the West still. The aim is kind of not so much about just strengthening one another, but about actually winning against and balancing out Western hegemony. In the context of COVID diplomacy, China needed Russia's endorsement of its successful performance on the international stage for its own legitimacy, especially domestically, to showcase that somebody says we're doing a good job, right? And Russia was that voice. And Russia deliberately endorsed China as a way to critique the incompetence of the West. The two players rely on one another in large part as kind of buffers or additives in disciplining and competing against the United States. This theme, again, is very prevalent in the context of this war, whereby a large proportion of China's official messaging about the war, again, is really anti-Western. I found that to be a striking feature of analyzing the media, how much of the emphasis is on the West, on the US, as a basically immoral actor, but also as the West as the instigator of this war, basically militarizing NATO and pushing Russia towards the actions in Ukraine. So I want to conclude with a few questions about these implications of the book and especially these frictions that I just discussed, these kind of tensions that come up in this book as the key themes for me. The questions that I wanted to pose to Una for further discussion. So starting with the domestic external variations and narratives, this idea of sealed-off environments, you argue that the limited overlap in information spaces between China and Russia allows for the two countries to project different messages externally and domestically. As we're seeing an increasing convergence in information spaces between China and the United States, whereby messaging about one another domestically gets quickly transmitted, right, to one another's kind of media spaces through social media. How much of that is possibly going to happen also vis-a-vis China and Russia? Are those environments kind of permanently sealed, or is there something porous about them that perhaps will shift over time, whereby those domestic grievances and nationalistic sentiments will eventually make it over to the other side? So do you see those environments as kind of permanently taken out of each other's spheres, or is there some room for them to be malleable and even converging? The second question I have is about the rhetorical pronouncements of friendship and suspicion, right? Mutual suspicion. So given that there's this kind of key factor of mutual suspicion that seems to delay or inhibit on any practical collaboration, are there channels for overcoming or lessening this bilateral suspicion, right? So suspicion exists, but is there anything there to kind of help mitigate that? For instance, what about knowledge exchanges, people-to-people networks, and other ways of kind of collaborating across these two spaces, these two countries? You note the very kind of high levels of favorability of China in Russia. So public opinion seems to be relatively favorable vis-a-vis China. There is also an increasing number of students, right, from Russia studying in China, maybe less so on the other side. Is that something that kind of helps aid this mutual suspicion, or is it too marginal to really matter? So that's my second question. The third question I have is that if the primary orientation of China-Russia nexus is really against the US, and yet the shared frictions and mistrust inhibit the deepening of their practical alliance, how should the West react to the symbolic convergence? Is China-Russia relationship really a threat, as many argue it is? And I know you mentioned that this is too simplistic, but given that there's so little kind of substance to it, should basically Western journalists and people in DC, in the policy think tank worlds, kind of not be as worried, as concerned about this relationship, considering the lack of practical implications? And lastly, given your positionality as a scholar based in Riga in Latvia, is there regional competition between China and Russia in the Baltics? And if so, what does that entail? In your book, you discuss China-Russia joint military exercises in the Baltic Sea. But are there other areas where the two nations are either cooperating or competing in the Baltics? So how much of that space is becoming contested? How does that compare to Central Asia or anywhere else in the world? I'd love to hear more about that. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Maria. So why don't I'll stand aside and why don't you respond, and then in a few minutes we'll open up the floor for Q&A.
Yeah, I was typing away. Thank you so much, Maria, for your remarks. Now to the questions. Yes, those are really. The questions have many layers. So first of all, the conversion of these information spaces, if there's a chance where that can happen with Russia, China, given the situation that the news from the U.S. travel fast, I would say that the main, if I had to guess, the most credible way how these information spaces could clash or meet would be, because those are 13 states, there would be a top to bottom decision. Something that we saw in, what was it, when did the Russians shoot down the Turkish plane? Was that 2015 or 2017? Basically, what happened, that was a smaller scale demonstration of how Russia operates with the friend versus foe narrative. So before that, Turkey, is a friend, a lot of exchanges, culture. And then overnight, when there was a dispute, immediately the stories, what the Turks think about us. That's what they say. They actually don't want us. So then you lift this seal, and then 2 years later, when it's all normalized, and then they kick the students out and everyone else. So, and then it's back to friendship again. So the point I'm trying to make is that the U.S. news travels fast because these international media, U.S. media conglomerates they do have a big stake in the global information market, right? Unlike Russia and China. And so this is, if it happens, if these information spaces do merge or clash, it's not going to happen just naturally because, for example, the stake of the Russian news in the global information market would increase, but it would happen as a top-to-bottom approach, as a decision. Let's now tell our populations what the other side thinks. That's my. Can
I just make a quick point in response?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, what I had in mind about the kind of bottom-up convergence is this new. Well, it's a relatively new phenomenon in the U.S.-China space as well. But it's this new translation movement. I don't know if you've seen it, but basically it's this Twitter kind of platform movements set up. I think by some students. I don't know exactly who all of them are, but basically they're translating very nationalistic discourses and statements from Chinese Weibo platform towards Twitter users. So basically anybody can see what the nationalistic discourse is like in China in English. But that's kind of a bottom-up sort of creation. Maybe there is not enough initiative for that, to happen on the Russian side. Like somebody has to actually be really interested to do that, right? Like that's a...
Yes, now I understand. Sorry, I had misunderstood. I thought you spoke more about traditional media and that convergence. Well, yes, in Russia, this information is available, but normally the ones who are interested in it, but it's like a marginal topic. So the ones who are interested in it are the people who study China for a living, for the most part, or people who are at some level involved in some policies regarding this. But at the end of the day, this does not spread to wider population. Yeah. It was exactly. Yeah, that's what caused, and that was 2015, right? Yeah. 2015. Yeah. Then 2017 is when they went back to business as usual, I guess. Yeah. Sorry, I'm bad. You're right. Did I say it the other way around? Sorry. Now to the second question. Mutual suspicion delays cooperation, and is there a way to mitigate that in terms of people to people? Again, I think that kind of feeds back into the previous topic about how much do societies really interact. And I think we can look back again into not so recent past, but back to during the Sino-Soviet split. Before that, the people-to-people links were extraordinary. There were hundreds of thousands of mixed families between Russians and the Chinese. There were decades of exchanges in terms of Chinese communists going to study to Russia. I mean, half of the Politburo's children had grown up in Ivanovo. They didn't even speak Chinese at first, right? And never mind that. Basically overnight in the late 50s, these links were cut. So these people-to-people links that exist now, they go nowhere as high as it was in the 50s. And I've actually interviewed people who were parts of these families in China. So the people-to-people exchanges are still marginal. And even if we see the tourism numbers grow, it is still not in-depth exchanges. On the student part, though, because it's not about really knowing the other side. But on the student part, though, I think that is where the exchanges are definitely taking place, but the numbers just aren't so big. Another interesting thing, actually, that happened was that Russia was also not immune to the Chinese language craze that took over the world in, what was it, 2000s, late 2000s, early 2010s. Many schools, primary schools, high schools, opened Chinese language classes, and a lot of kids were learning Chinese, just like elsewhere. Now, whether that has led to deeper people-to-people links, I think that's a research question that, I cannot answer right now, but definitely that also happened. So kids were learning Chinese a lot, and they still are. Now, to the third question, is the China-Russia relationship really a threat, and should we be concerned about it in Brussels or in Washington for that matter? I mean, you don't want to, when you're sitting, I mean, I work a lot with NATO officials, and if you're sitting at a table where threats are being discussed, it's always better to be prepared and to have these scenarios in mind rather to be complacent and to be the one person at the table saying, don't relax, nothing's going to happen. So I'm not that person who's telling the NATO officials to relax when it comes to the Russia-China relationship. However, let me just say that I do not think that there is a convergence where it matters, that there's confluence in actions and in deeds between Russia and China. And I think the story about military help, the leak about the military help request, whatever that was, kind of also signifies that China will just not risk at this point openly lending a hand to Russia militarily. So I would say let's remain concerned, but in our long list of concerns, this is not going to be the position number one. Now, this is how I tell the NATO officials. Now, as
private briefing here.
Yeah. Among other things. But is there regional competition of China, Russia, and the Baltic? Oh, that's an excellent question. We've actually written a lot of stuff about it. We've examined the information environments, all sorts of things. And actually, there is not much competition, but there is a little bit of a mutual learning approach, and sometimes, especially in the information space, both country actors use the same kind of inroads. They interview the same officials that are a little bit politicians that are a little bit on the fringe side for their outlets. They use this. They cooperate with the same outlets to tell their stories. So you're gonna see a news outlet that kind of talks about Russian geopolitical views, also publishing these interviews with the Chinese ambassador, talking about how things are in how China views things. So I do not see confluence, but I do see, and I have to quote here also my colleagues from, for example, Dr. Ivana Karaskova, who is in Czech at AMO, who does a lot of this research and runs the Choice, China and Central and Eastern Europe Watchers or Observers Network. So there is no direct confluence. There's mutual learning. And the competition part, it's just, we're not very interesting for China as a region. So everything we get from China is kind of secondhand. We get secondhand narratives that are not specifically aimed at the Baltics, that are just part of a wider story that just make it through the ranks. We get secondhand business proposals that aren't really interesting for that do not really have a lot to do with the local with how the business community wants to operate with China. So that is my take on that.
Thank you. Very interesting. I have a lot more questions, but I'm sure others do too. So we can turn to.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And before I want to ask if you wanted to respond, Maria, or if to that. Because I'll open up the floor for questions, but I have a couple observations and a question I'd like to ask as well.
Maybe just a couple of very quick points, because I know others want to talk as well. I mean, I guess just a lot of these areas to me in the book in particular, they could be expanded much broader. There's a lot there to explore further. Like the book kind of gives us this really incredible, dense, informational contour about how these things work and don't work. And I think each one of these chapters could be its own longer article or a longer piece in and of itself. So there's a lot more, I think, to kind of dive into. And again, the questions of frictions and challenges to me is just, these gaps and why they are there, kind of turning more towards, describing that they're there, but more explaining towards why. Why is this the case? And I think the information environment, the sealed-off authoritarian information environment is one interesting factor. But maybe there are other forces, playing into it, bureaucratic forces on both sides. And I think in your book you also talked about local governance policies. You talked about kind of more delegation towards local officials in the context of COVID, for instance, in Russia versus China. So kind of different governance strategies and how that also affects Russia-China relations. So kind of the internal domestic factors that maybe will contribute to some of these gaps in policy making as opposed to rhetoric. I think to me those are really interesting factors to explore further. And I think on the Baltics as well is just the idea of convergence that you mentioned, the sort of signaling one another, learning from each other. I think that's a larger theme that could also be explored in other contexts. We often think about competition, but again, as in Central Asia, it's not a zero-sum game, but also they're observing one another and learning. So if it's a similar actors they're speaking to, similar interviews, similar outlets that they're giving interviews to, I find that to be really fascinating. The idea that there's kind of this shared sort of space within which they're working it's almost side by side, kind of in parallel worlds. I think that's a really fascinating point to expand to maybe interrogate empirically in other places. So I'll end there, but I'm sure we'll talk more in more detail afterwards.
Can I make a quick point? I'm so sorry. I just wanted to, you touched upon a very important thing. The question, which is kind of a wider question, how decentralized, in fact, and how contradictory Chinese foreign policy making is in the country itself. Because we've been on panels with colleagues who are researchers from China and who work in the West but are working with the Chinese materials, and who say, in fact, there is such a big debate right now in terms of Chinese foreign policy, such different directions. Everybody's trying to pull it in different ways, and that for example, when someone makes a point about China's policy towards Central and Eastern Europe, then the argument is, well, it's so contradictory because there are so many different stakeholders that play.
Actors,
exactly. And not just on the government level. Of course, you have the administrative level, and you have the company interests who go and also try to lobby and to try to move things. So I think when it comes to the why question, I avoided it in some cases because I knew that I didn't have enough answers about how did this come to be on the Chinese side. And I was afraid of, even though when it comes to narratives, it's okay, I think, when you analyze authoritarian states and their foreign policy messages, it's okay to just put it under the umbrella term of China, right? So China's foreign policy message in this or that case, especially when it's strategic narratives. But when it comes to these smaller details and maybe second-tier interests, when of course, Ukraine is a first-tier, is very important, but then you have these smaller, for example, our region, and you don't really know, it's murky, you don't really know what's going on. Without interviews, it would be really hard to establish. But I take your point absolutely that we need the why. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks very much. So just a couple comments and then one question before we, so the first comment was in you, and this is more for the audience here as well as people who will be tuning in once this goes online. You began by saying, I'm humbly presenting my surface scratching. It is a lot more than that. So I just want people to get a sense that the chapters are short. It is not a long book, but they are extremely rich in terms of information. The second thing I wanted to say is, one of the ironies of discourse analysis is that it tends to be incomprehensible much of the time in which it's presented. That is not the case here. And so it really, I think it occupies a space that I think lends itself to a very, very wide audience. And I think that your foray into COVID does not in any way, shape, or form date this. I think quite the contrary. I mean, I think it really sets us up to where we are today. So that was the kind of the first set of comments I wanted to make, that this is really very, very much worth having on your shelf, close by,
Right here.
so that you can you can reach for it and draw from it. The second comment I wanted to make was, I was very interested in, when you were talking about it, so what is the beginning of the relationship, and that's something that you and Bill talked about as well. It's funny how in your comments you were talking about, and not necessarily agreeing with, but this idea of, we're back in the 1950s. But it strikes me as so many other kind of Mao area tropes that Xi Jinping really seems to draw from. It's actually not at all like it was. So you spoke about it in terms of the kind of the asymmetry of not asymmetry, but the comparison of student exchanges then versus now. I would actually also venture to say that, if you see a picture of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin together, it's kind of there's the whole relationship, and insofar as you do talk about kind of this personal relationship between the leaders of these two very, very strong countries, nothing at all like Mao and Stalin, and nothing at all like Mao and Khrushchev. So it is, I think the narratives within the narratives themselves, I think, need to, that we should, that we should do what you tell us to do in this book, by leading by example, by scrutinizing these. And I think it's, there's just a lot of really, really good, rich information. The question that I have, and is that I love the way you put this, and I'm going to ask you if you could possibly kind of draw kind of more speculative, and you too, Maria, insofar as this I don't even know if any of this ventures into your, into your world, but I love the way you spoke about Russia and China, kind of respectively, as disruptivist versus non-disruptivist.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. Really.
Yeah, and that's that has all sorts of implications in terms of how we look at technological development, how do we look at ways in, how we look at the relationship between those two countries, the cleavages that itself might create, and the just the kind of the effect that those two types of approaches and outlooks, might, how they might play out. So let me stop with with that question there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, thanks. I completely agree with you with this playing with the 1950s. It's almost as if it's like an inside joke for them as well, a little bit, right? But of course, and then we want to jump to parallels, but at the same time, they're just not there. And of course, when it comes to Khrushchev, actually, you mentioning Khrushchev is one of the questions that is the question that I get a lot is what will it take to stop this relationship? What can change, right? What would the limitation be? And again, then we can, looking back, because you can't help but look to the 50s, you would say, okay, maybe one of them dies, right? And then the situation of Mao and Khrushchev, who he thought was a revisionist, appears. Even though, of course, and that's the question of whether we believe that ideology at some point, of course, not in the sense of the 1950s, but still as an anti-liberal ideology, whether that determines this relationship at all. So now to the question, the disruptivist versus non-disruptivist. Okay, I understand. This is, of course, a simplification, and I understand that we can argue about this, but that was what the messaging And that was actually from one of the interviews from several interviews that emerged, this perception that, speaking to my Chinese counterparts, was that we don't, like, what is the big issue with China-Russia relationship? Where there was a word, there were several words used that I found very interesting. For example, that Russia is quite emotional about its neighborhood, and that was before the war in Ukraine. That was before. So, kind of again a nice way of saying they're not very stable when it comes to their outlooks on geopolitics. So there and also other points that and also when I was talking to some UN officials just to get a background, and I didn't include that in the book even, I was just trying to get a sense of how these interactions take place. I had numerous descriptions of discussion behavior of the Russian versus the Chinese envoys, and there was also this idea that yes, the Chinese are trying to push their approach and build up their standards and kind of just take over a lot of things, but it's perceived to be kind of a bend from within, rather than my way or screw you everyone, right? So, but that's again, I kind of bit myself here because on one hand, I started off saying that binaries are not helpful, and then I finish off with like a major binary. And how might that play out? I think that is definitely one of the limitations of the relationship, long term, because Russia does something like Ukraine, and then China has to, and China is in a very uncomfortable position over it. So, and I think that's definitely how Beijing feels today as well, or rather felt after February 24. And I think we also saw that in some of the messaging, this feeling of being very uncomfortable over the situation, stressing that Ukraine is also a partner, publishing a full, on one hand, rhetorically supporting Russia, but on the other hand, publishing a full uncensored interview with Dmytro Kuleba on Xinhua website, where he says, everything that he thinks about the Russians. So these kinds of things. So I think that it is one of the roadblocks towards a stronger, more trustful relationship.
Great, thank you very, very much. So we have a lot of time, and so we, you should feel free to raise your hand. Z, in a conflict of interest, he's the one who holds the keys to the kingdom, but he also is the one who oftentimes asks the first question. So, Z, go ahead and ask your question, and then then we'll go to the audience.
Thank you. That's why you have the monopoly on the resource.
Wow.
Just kidding. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. China-Russia relations is definitely something I really interested in as well. I really enjoy studying a lot of things related to Russian politics in general in my free time. It's really fun to read. It's much more interesting than most of the political horror novels. So yeah. So there are several questions I have. The first one is on from the Russian side, especially among Russian elites, what's their view of China? Because some of the saying are like the Russian elites are racist, and they're talking about this the Great Slavism, and part of that is the dislike or even just hatred toward they view as Asian culture or whatever. And I mean, Putin did say that Russia have an Eastern European identity back in 2005, speaking flawless German in German parliament, even though that's a long time ago, and he was speaking at the German parliament. But I think many scholars have said that he's not lying, that Russia does identify itself with Europe much culturally than as Asia. So how do they feel about Asia and the fact that they have to cooperate with an Asian country and even sometimes being a junior partner? And also I find it interesting with your concept of perfect imbalance, because once you're explaining this concept, it's not the China-Russian relations that jump up to me, it's more China-North Korean relations that jump up to me. So I think maybe in the future there can be a comparative study on even like how China is dealing with Russia, if they view Russia as a junior partner versus North Korea, where North Korea is certainly a junior partner, but so successful in pulling leverage and making every Chinese leader like headache. And the third one is, since you're from the Baltics, I really want to ask you about, has Russia and China been cooperating in terms of dealing with Baltic countries like Lithuania, since the relations have been falling off? And at least from my observation of the Chinese state media, I saw it after the relations have been falling off. Definitely, China has been blaming Lithuania for everything they did, like either Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and whatnot. But they always also talked about how Lithuanians or the Baltics in general are not happy about the so-called Russian liberating them and the entire things about World War II veterans, and use that as pretty much as a crime, even as a crime against Lithuania, on how, like, you see those people are right now opposing World War II, like rewriting the history of World War II, and then using that to incite some of the sentiment that China has with Japan. So I wonder there's sort of like collaboration between like China and Russia in terms of dealing with Baltics or dealing with those kind of second-hand issues in some like even limited form. Thank you so much.
You want me to? Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lee, for the question. So yes, the Russian side and their perspective. That's a fascinating thing. Something that I've also tried to look into, and also coming from, I'm half Russian ethnically, so I have some of some of the limitations that come with that, because of course I know more about Russians than I do know about China, even though that's my job. But still, I've tried to unpack that, and the Russian elites actually, again, first of all, let me start with the war in Ukraine. What we saw through the Russian propaganda channels was that for the outside audience, it said, we have the Chinese by our side. They also hate the states. They're also oppose hegemony. We're going to be fine, right? You know what? You give us sanctions, заменим. We will find a way to replace your McDonald's, right? and your phones. Like, Chinese are producing pretty good tech. But when you turn on the TV for the Russian audiences, it's a panic. The Chinese are coming. They're opportunistic. They're going to take over our companies cheaply now that they've lost stock. They will use, and that's something that goes back to what Maria said about this idea that even the nationalists in China that support Russia against the U.S. still say, okay, this could be a good chance to change a little bit of that relationship. So Russia is very much afraid of that, and they're talking about that. So again, this disruption. But now to this, you asked a wider question, not just particular towards this case, but wider in terms of perception of China and Asia in general. And I like how you tied it with the perception of the self, right? So on one hand, it's the eagle that looks both ways, but on the other hand, of course, Russian, and I think that's another thing that is similar in terms of the challenging that Xi and Putin are facing. Both of these countries are very multi-ethnic, but they are kind of solidified around the core of the main nation. And in Russia, that main nation, even though it's a multi-ethnic country, a multiracial country, but that main nation is Russians with the post-Peter the Great, pro-European, kind of European-looking and towards Europe-looking culture, and the perception that indeed it is the Europe, but is the true Europe that will save the West, right? The third Rome that will, not let everyone be turned gay by liberals. And I'm not even, exaggerating. I've had people tell me that that's like the major goal, that's ridiculous. Of course, it's very sad, right? But that's the idea, that we are the West and we have the essence of what the Western civilization should be, whereas it's decaying further in other Western countries. But so this idea, and I take your point that there's a little bit of a consolation prize logic when it comes to Asia and to cooperation with Asia. You can't help but see all these achievements and also be afraid of them, as I illustrated, but also kind of think, And there is racism in it as well. And actually, the Russian racism towards Asians is a very interesting phenomenon. Right now, during the war in Ukraine, for example, we've seen how the story of Buryats being the murderers and the rapists rather than ethnic Russians caught so much attention and traction among Russian anti-war liberals. It's the Asians, it's the Buryats who are doing all these things. It's not us, right? So I think that definitely race has to do with it as well. And now pride and what you also said about cooperating with an Asian country as a junior partner, especially now that the roles are reversed. The story of the glorious Soviet Union, providing China and teaching China, and now it's becoming a reversed, is painful. So you need to come up with domestic narratives that still prove that you're strong, that you are the leader, and that you're being respected. And I think that's what they're doing. Now, how is China? Yes, North Korea is such an interesting. I haven't looked into it. I was thinking about doing it as one of the case studies, but then I thought I wouldn't be able to access a lot of interesting primary sources. I would just end up repeating what the others have written. But that is definitely something. And if you apply this concept, I'd be happy to read. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, there was another question. Can I quickly? Is it okay if I take it? I'm so sorry. I really have to learn to be more brief. But it's just such a multi-layered question. Now you asked about Russia and China cooperating in dealing with Lithuania. That's exciting because, of course, just like you said, I've also read Chinese state media signaling about they're so anti-Russian and they are. All the time, they're the Lithuanians are doing this. The new government that came in after December 2020 is doing this anti-authoritarian story in general. Of course, Belarus, right? After August 2020. In Belarus also, that was the Lithuanian story, so we do not support that. And then China comes as a package deal here as well. So, of course, the anti-Western media in Lithuania have been saying that, you're trying to now you've have bad relations with China, and now you've antagonized Russia. Let's see where you go from here. Kind of that approach. But active cooperation has not appeared again. So it's like, I think to quote Maria, it's a parallel worlds. They're not necessarily moving in different directions, but they're a little bit kind of in parallel. But yes, the Chinese media has caught that argument.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. The next question goes to Harley. You've been very patient.
Thank you very much. I'm Harley Balzer. I'm Professor Emeritus at Georgetown. I guess since you wrote about the COVID issue, this one is the kind of thing you have to know Chinese to be able to answer. Has Feng Feng's Wuhan diary been circulating on the internet in Shanghai and Beijing during the lockdown? And the much bigger question, I guess, I'd love to be able to write a really good article comparing the 1950s to the last decade in the China-Russia relationship. The thing that seems to get lost when we talk about the 50s, and you talked about how thick the relationship was. These thousands of Chinese, tens of thousands, studying engineering and science in Russia, family connections. And what we see now is there are almost no Chinese going to Russia anymore to study. And if they do, they go to study language and social science, not natural science or technology. When the Russians get technology from China, it turns out to be GLONASS satellite components that aren't hardened for high altitude space radiation. It's not working very much. But in the 50s, Khrushchev and Mao were at loggerheads, right? And there was real animosity. Mao thought he should be the successor to Stalin in the communist world. Now what you've got is Xi and Putin putting on this great show of friendship, collaboration, cooperation, and down below there's not much of anything. And I actually had this out with one China scholar recently, and he said, well, the 50s proved that Mao and Khrushchev could shut it down. And he's right, they can shut it down. The question is, can they build it up?
Yes, excellent points. About the Fanghui's diary and whether it's been circulating during the lockdown, I don't know. We have to, but we have a lot of expertise in the room, so maybe somebody else could answer. Good. And I'd love to hear the answer as well. Now, let me jump to the second question and your comment. Absolutely, there was a substance to this in the 50s, and more substance than today. And just to add to your list of things that the Chinese students go to study to Russia, still, I would say music and theater and dance are still in that. But of course, it's like along with language. But that is just so small scale comparing to the 50s. So whether this can be built back up, now the question is whether such close relationship is in the interest, is something they're looking for. Maybe they're perfectly happy with signaling to the outside audiences, and by them I mean, of course, Xi's establishment and Putin's establishment. They're perfectly happy signaling to the outside world that they are partners without limits, but at the same time keeping each other out of more creating, at the same time avoiding interdependencies and too much entanglement. I can't help but think, so maybe they don't want to build it back up to the level it was in the 50s.
Thank you. Other questions?
And you guys can also answer. It's not just
Sure. Oh, I was going to turn that around to the people in this, in this room, because being over 50 myself, I'm not the person who's best situated to talk about social media phenomena. So if anybody does have the answer to that question, please, don't hesitate to chime in. Go ahead.
All right. I always managed to get the volume on this wrong. There we go. So first I want to say thank you both for coming and taking the time to have this discussion today. And Professor Mertha, of course, thanks for helping organize this. I have two questions. Well, maybe I'll sneak a third one in there. The first is one of the main arguments that I've heard within the international relations community is the U.S. Policy towards China has done a lot to drive China into Russia's arms. But given the sort of disconnect between rhetoric and action that you've highlighted, how much blame would you lay at the feet of U.S. foreign policy? Is this really a significant driver of this relationship? And then for Professor Repnikova, you've done a lot of work, especially recently on Chinese soft power, and you have a very keen eye for Chinese state media and kind of what they're doing. So my question is, when it comes to, echoing Kremlin points, are they echoing any new points or only Kremlin propaganda points that existed already within Chinese state media for the past several years or even decades? And back to Una, you explained your title and what it means. How did you find out about this concept? How did you choose this title for the book?
Quickly, I have a 15-year-old daughter who loves to game. But to the first question, that is a very interesting way to look at it. I actually, and that is again a question of belief, whether the U.S. policy and the trade war specifically has driven China into Russia's arms. I think not. I think it has. Of course, it's created a situation, a very open enmity towards between the countries. But at the end of the day, the ironic thing is that everything U.S. is not happy about with China, Russia has the same issues with China, and that comes up in conversations between policymakers. That comes up in a veiled way in Kremlin-associated and Valdai-associated think tanks in their reports when they're saying, they're not using the Western words for it. They're not saying, level playing field or forced technology transfer, but basically those are the same things they're not happy with. They're not saying that Chinese companies necessarily operate as bad actors on Russian territory in terms of, ecology and in terms of corruption or some bad practices, but they're finding another way to say it. So I don't think that this, and I think the U.S. guilt, U.S. guilt over foreign policies, over starting a domino effect is definitely can be debated, but is a little bit blown out of proportion at this point.
So thank you for the question and for coming. It's great to meet you in person. In terms of the echoing of propaganda points, I guess what you mean is are they echoing directly kind of Russia's talking points versus maybe coming up with different ones? I wasn't sure what you meant by new ones.
So, the thing about... So specifically, when it comes to, echoing certain points like, the U.S. is at fault because of NATO expansion, or U.S. and the West, that's a point that's existed within Chinese media for a while. But then, in terms of the, Russian position of we're going in to denazify Ukraine, is that something that's echoed by Chinese media? And are there other points that, kind of new points put forward by the Kremlin that Chinese state media has adopted?
Yeah, so in terms of the points that they've adopted, it's a mix of the two. So on the one hand, the anti-Western angle, I think, is very prominent. And as you say, this has existed in Chinese discourse before the war. So it was kind of a convenient tag-on to Russia's talking points. It wasn't anything particularly novel, but this opportunity of this crisis presented a chance for, I think, very particular propagandists in the system, including some spokespeople for the foreign ministry, to really ride on that train of anti-Western kind of signaling. So that's the first point. But the other point is that there has been also adaptation of some Russia's talking points that didn't exist in the discourse before. So for example, denazification has come up in Chinese state media, in particular in Xinhua. Coverage for domestic audiences in Chinese language, they have echoed and directly translated Russia's ambitions about this war, denazification, and they also used the word military operation for a very long time until recently, at least my collaborator and graduate student just found out, I think late April, they started using the Russia-Ukraine war as opposed to the military operation. But up until just a few weeks ago, they were still using military operation, which is Russia's talking point. So, and thirdly, even if they don't use specific talking points, they cite Russian sources. So they cite Russian officials disproportionately, and they also cite Russian state media in their own coverage of the war. So instead of reporting from Ukraine's perspective or directly from Ukraine, they will cite Russian footage. So if you watch Xinhua Lianbo, right, on CCTV news nightly newscast, you will see that a lot of footage comes from the Russian side as opposed to Ukrainian side. That has shifted a bit recently, but in particular with global TV channels like CGTN, they're covering more Ukrainian perspectives, but the domestic ones are covering more Russian perspectives. So there is that kind of friction as well. But I think the extent to which Russian propaganda points, perspectives, and narratives have been echoed in this war is really fascinating, and to me was just kind of striking to see if this is a unique case or if we're going to see something similar in other crises, and also if China were to be involved militarily in Taiwan, would Russia also echo those points, or would they kind of stray away from being involved? So what would happen if this was a reverse scenario? I'm not so sure, but very interesting question. Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Thank you very much. I don't know which question should be precisely addressed to which panel speakers here, but thank you very much. My name is Wang Kaijun. I'm a second-year MA student here, but also a foreign policy advisor for a Taiwanese legislator that is involved in security issues. I think I have two questions. One is about Taiwan. I think one of the panelists has kind of briefly answered that, and the second part is about most closely related to Japan. So the first one is, I do understand that in 2021, October, Putin has said that there's no need for China to use arms when it comes to unification with Taiwan. But then in the joint statement in 2022, February, he reiterated Russia's stance about supporting unification and supporting this one China policy. And then, Taiwan imposed sanctions on Russia, is starting to impose some sort of export control on semiconductor products. And also Russia, in response, listed Taiwan into unfriendly country/region for other stuff. But it is very interesting to see right now Russia hasn't reinforced a lot of it is so-called sanction on Taiwan. So for example, Russia hasn't canceled any kinds of visa treatments to Taiwan. Russia hasn't really engaged in any sorts of natural gas sanctions on Taiwan. So the first question is, will the degree of Russia's sanctions on Taiwan depends on China's attitude to Ukraine and the stance on Ukraine? And the second question is basically on when it comes to Russia's emotional response on border disputes, and also perhaps the lack of coordination between China and Russia on security policies in North Asia. So, for example, Russia and China had bombers flew over airspace close to Japan in 2021 November. And then before that, in October, you also had Russian-China Navy joint exercise went across the channel between Hokkaido and Honshu. And the Russians are currently, I don't think they're currently doing that right now, but still they are having a lot of military exercise in the northern territories that's close to Hokkaido. And then the Japanese media's response is that they're fearing the Russians are fortifying their position permanently in those places. So it is very likely you're going to invoke more of a joint US-Japan response. For example, maybe increase some sort of security deployments. But what about Russia and China? Are they going to keep doing this joint military exercise when the war is still continuing? Thank you.
And since we're running short on time, Devin, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. My name is Devin Woods. I'm a first-year MA student here at SAIS, and yeah, you beat me to it on the Japan question. But I also just wanted to ask briefly to really any and all of you if you had any thoughts about how the China-Russia partnership might play out in Africa in the future, especially with regard to collaborating on security infrastructure. Thank you.
So I can then give my 2 cents on Taiwan, and then it's over to Maria about Africa. Well, sorry, not Taiwan, but Japan, yeah. So let's look at this from, let's turn this around a little bit. Russia, one of the stories about being great actually also involves, in the story about being under-noticed and underrepresented in Russia, is the story that we're a Pacific power. And that is why we keep hearing about how China took the Quad personally, but Russia took the Quad for that reason also very personally, even though we do not normally talk about Russia as a, Indo-Pacific or Pacific power a lot. So I think a lot of things that are happening in the posturing, in the naval force posturing through joint exercise close to Japan has to do with this domestic story of do not forget, lest you forget that we are a Pacific power. And of course, and in Russia, it's being framed, of course, as it always is, as a response to the increasing presence of U.S. coordinated security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. So yes, so will Russia and China continue that kind of, at least I would say that's posturing. I mean, I do not think that, China does take part in Russian exercises, but in percent-wise, it's not very significant. But of course, it's about posturing, right? So I think yes, they will continue because we see AUKUS, we see the Quad, we see NATO in the new upcoming strategic concept talking about how do we phrase the Indo-Pacific, that it's going to be a presence in the NATO strategic documents, right? So yes, this will continue.
Okay, so on China-Russia partnership in Africa or competition, I don't study the security domain so much, so I can't comment empirically whether or not they're really collaborating, but just a couple of points across kind of the broader relationship in the African context. I think they're involved in sort of parallel realities and engagements in Africa. So China is much more large-scale, multifaceted actor when it comes to its various projects in Africa, from the economic perspective to resources to infrastructure, including economic space, but also some security domain, but not as extensive as economic, and then quite significant engagement in capacity building and soft power, which is what I focus on in my research. So they're really invested in building this relationship across many different layers, especially trainings, of elite officials, engaging in all kinds of exchanges, people-to-people ties, and really taking this relationship very seriously in many ways, kind of framing direct kind of messaging specifically for African audiences, in contrast to, say, the Baltics. I think they're really kind of prepared extensively in how to engage with these publics and elites, especially elites. But in the context of Russia, I think the engagement is much more focused on arms exports and kind of disruptive engagement, which goes back to the ideas we talked about earlier, this kind of disruptive versus something else, non-disruptive or constructive. I talk about this as kind of disruptive versus constructive in some of my research or comparisons on China and Russia. But the notion of kind of extensive disinformation campaigns, as well as arms sales, all of that is kind of a disruption nexus, as opposed to, say, something of Russia's vision towards Africa. More recently, Russia has mimicked some of China's approaches of holding summits with African elites and leaders, and it seems to have resonated to some extent, but how much of it is going to translate into actual resources on the ground, right? It seems like they're, again, rhetorically seem to be engaged, and there's a strong legacy of Soviet presence in Africa, and quite a bit of popularity of Putin himself across the board. So in my research in Ethiopia, I just heard over and over how wonderful Putin is and how much, inspiration there is of his anti-Western kind of strength and positionality. So, and now in this war in Ukraine, we also see many African states abstaining from directly voting against Russia in the UN Security Council, and basically there's quite a bit of convergence across the global south in the context of the war, which is also interesting. But I still think that Russia is not investing enough or nearly as much as China into this relationship. And one kind of vignette to conclude this with is when I was doing my fieldwork in Ethiopia, I visited the Russian Cultural Center, and the director of the center told me very directly, he's like, who's in charge of all the kind of soft power, the capacity building here? He said, of course, it's China. And he wasn't happy about it, but he's like, we all know who is number one. So like we can never compete, because just in terms of how much they're investing. So even though they have these legacies and historical roots, they can't really quite give as much as China is giving. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Back there, there's a... And why don't we ask a few, go to a few people. So I think Ifan has a question after.
Yeah, thank you so much, professors. My question, so my name's Arthur. I'm a second year MIF candidate at SAIS. So my question is about ASEAN countries. So basically, you both mentioned Vietnam, which basically Vietnamese export just kind of exceeds Shenzhen recently. And I'm curious about what does the perfect balance look like in the rest of the ASEAN nations, given that China has a lot of business involved with the e-commerce booming in Southeast Asia, and also China has a digital Silk Road in Malaysia, Thailand. I'm just curious about what's the Russia's role in Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor, for this amazing book talk. My name is Ifan. I'm a first-year PhD student here at SAIS, advisee of Professor Mertha. My question, I love the idea you mentioned, like there's massive room for growth in Central Asia, and I wanted to ask about the division of labor between China and Russia in the region. So, traditionally speaking, lots of scholars see China and Russia like in a way as guns and a wallet, right? Like where Russia serves as a role like of a traditional protector or guarantor of protection, and China involves in the region with more like financial or like economic investment. But I think both sides they're more ambitious than that, right? Like so there's like the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union, and also China wants to engage in the region in the area through more military aid. How do you think that is going to shift the balance of power or such perfect imbalance in the region? Thank you.
Oh, there's one more.
Oh, and let's ask one more question.
Very active students.
We'll do this. Yeah.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today. My name's Holly. I'm a first-year matter student. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the development in the Arctic. I think both Russia and China have their visions of approaching and possibly exploiting the region. Do you think that would be a new ground for cooperation between the two countries, or actually the source of tension and divergence? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the ASEAN question, actually, I'm part of a working group between EU and ASEAN scholars, and that was a question that I asked my colleagues, and of course, Vietnam stands out particularly. It's in other, and even in historically, right, we know the arms sales and everything, and the friendship as well. And even with Vietnam kind of drifting away from Russia and actually falling back, trying to explore how to use the U.S. to counterbalance China, we see even in Vietnam, which has had the most visits by far from Russian top political elites. There's very little to be said, and that is what my colleagues have told me. That is very little to be said about a Russian role, a significant Russian role, and using Russia to balance out China in any way in other ASEAN countries. But this is a topic I'm extremely interested in. So if you're looking into this, then we can talk later, and you could recommend me some readings. See, I mean that because that's really something I want to look into. Because I kind of felt that was a disadvantage of my book, because when I studied Central Asia, I looked at 5 countries plus Russia and China. And in terms of Southeast Asia, I only looked at 1 country plus Russia and China. So now to Yuan about the division of labor. Yes, guns and wallet, exactly. That's the perception we have a lot going into this. And then we realize that, in fact, both sides, like you said, are more ambitious. And we see that China is trying to establish security cooperation, security dialogues, because obviously China is worried about security in the Western regions and how the porous border and all kinds of things and ideologies and the three evils, right? The extremism, secessionism, and what was the third one? Terrorism, yes. So absolutely, China is trying to become more visible, and of course we know the Tajikistan, the weird base that's been established there, right? By China, it's becoming, it wants to know more. So what I've noticed is that it's not about hard traditional, kinetic security as much as being informed. And China is trying to talk to Central Asian countries without Russia being present, because my interlocutors have pointed out that when Russia is present, there is much less dialogue. So definitely, so that's why my chapter is about how both of these countries are trying to bypass each other. So without coming into a disagreement, but just trying to bypass each other in all of these spheres. Now to the Arctic. Yes, now with Russia's activities being suspended in the Council, in the Arctic Council, it's kind of back on the table again. Of course, Russia has these big fears about China being operating, and actually that boils back to Russia not trusting its own local officials in terms of ecology and in terms of corruption and all that. So and it's really, but at the same time, the Arctic for Russia is a catastrophe. It is grand, right? Just now, more territories have been added administratively to the Russian Arctic. But at the same time, in terms of quality of life, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of social lifts, it is a terrible problem in terms of economic development, of course. And so Russia needs something. And I think that Russia is not happy at this point with what China, with these kind of business, transactional, not very sustainable models of cooperation that China is after, which are, of course, the Yamal, the pumping out the resources over and over again, as we know, right? Or the row using the shipping routes that could become navigable throughout the year. But at the same time, Russia painfully also understands that it needs, and I think it's also in the strategy documents about the Arctic, that actually the Arctic document is one of the fairest stuff I've read coming out of the Russian establishment in a long time. They're basically saying, this is huge, we have a lot of problems. And they know that at the end of the day, they're going to have to fall back on someone. So that's so there's going to be some sort of negotiation over this cooperation in the Arctic with China, yes. That's my reading.
Well, on that polar note, what I'll do is I know that there's some time sensitivity, but we want to take a few moments and just and have a chat and interact after this. Please feel free to do so. I want to thank our guests once again for braving the elements to be here. So a round of applause. And I'd like to thank all of you for being so engaged. Really appreciate that you're here. So in any case, have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Can I just quickly say, I've never in my life had an audience that would stay for 2 hours and listen and talk. And this is the first in my life, and thank you so much for this.
Well, then let me just just say one last thing, which is you can tell the quality of a presentation as well as the quality of an audience by subtracting the number of people at the end of a talk from the number of people that were here at the beginning of the talk. And I think we're actually higher now than I think we've really messed with the time-space continuum. So thanks again, everybody. Appreciate it.